I am fairly certain I have consumed a piece of another human being. And the most terrifying part isn't the act itself, but how much I enjoyed the seasoning. This is a confession of the months I spent living next to Arthur Vance, a man whose meticulously manicured lawn hid a subterranean rot I am still scrubbing from my psyche. Before the sirens and the yellow tape, there was a moment in Arthur's basement where I stood over a deep freezer, my hands stained with something dark and tacky, watching a digital thermometer blink a steady, icy blue. The realization of what lay beneath those frozen bags of venison didn't hit me with a scream. It hit me with the sudden, violent memory of the way Arthur had watched me chew my dinner the night before. His eyes tracking the movement of my jaw with a hunger that had nothing to do with the food on his own plate. It makes you wonder how many people in your life are simply waiting for the right moment to invite you over for a meal. Moving to Blackwood Lane was supposed to be my fresh start. A quiet suburban escape from a life that had become too loud and too fast. Arthur Vance was the first person to greet me, standing at the edge of my driveway with a jar of homemade preserves and a smile that seemed to reach every part of his face except the very center of his pupils. He was a retired surgeon, or so he said, a man of precise movements and an even more precise garden. Every hedge was leveled to the millimeter, and his flower beds were a riot of deep, arterial red peonies that seemed to thrive better than anything else on the block. He was the neighborhood's pillar, the man who fixed broken fences and offered medical advice over the mailbox. Yet there was a stillness to him that felt less like peace and more like a predator holding its breath. I used to envy him, the way he carried himself with an unsettling charisma that made it impossible for the town to suspect anything sinister. He donated to local charities, hosted neighborhood barbecues, and played the role of the perfect citizen with such surgical precision that he became a symbol of success in our small town. His house was a reflection of that success. High ceilings, sleek furniture, and spotless floors that looked like they had been staged for a magazine shoot. But even then, there was something clinical about the atmosphere, a scent of heavy cleaning supplies that suggested someone was constantly scrubbing away a stain that refused to vanish. The first disturbance was subtle, the kind of thing you dismiss as the eccentricity of the elderly or the burden of a grieving man. I began noticing that Arthur's gardening wasn't limited to the daylight hours. From my bedroom window, I would see the glow of a heavy-duty flashlight bouncing against the fence line at 3 a.m, the beam cutting through the dark like a scalpel. He wasn't planting. He was digging deep, narrow holes and backfilling them with heavy bags of lime. When I asked him about it the next morning, he simply wiped a smudge of dark earth from his forehead and told me that the soil in this town was acidic, requiring constant, aggressive balancing to keep the roses from wilting. I wanted to believe him, but the smell that began to waft from his backyard on humid afternoons was not the scent of fertilizer. It was a cloying, sweet heaviness that clung to the back of my throat, a scent I recognized from my time working in a pathology lab. It wasn't just the garden that felt off. It was the way the people around him started to disappear. A few weeks ago, a local family vanished, just gone like smoke in the wind. And while the town buzzed with whispers, Arthur played the grieving neighbor like a seasoned professional. He was all over the local news, pleading for information, but when the cameras weren't on him, he acted like nothing was wrong. I'd see him mowing the lawn, smiling at neighbors, or cracking jokes at the mailbox while the search parties were still combing the woods. It was a performance, a mask of sanity that was starting to slip at the edges, and I was the only one close enough to see the darkness beneath the facade. The pattern of his behavior became a rhythmic, suffocating part of my existence. Every Tuesday, a white, unmarked van would pull into Arthur's driveway, and he would spend hours unloading heavy, industrial-sized blue plastic drums into his garage. He never used a dolly. For a man of his age, his strength was unnatural, his muscles corded like old rope as he wrestled the weight into the shadows. Neighbors would wave, and he would wave back with a bloody gardening glove, always charming, always the doctor our small town craved. But the whispers in my head started to grow louder when the stray dogs began to vanish, followed by the local runaways that the police didn't seem particularly interested in finding. Arthur would host his monthly neighborhood barbecues, the smoke from his oversized grill billowing over the fences, and everyone would marvel at the richness of his secret marinade. I found myself watching him more than I should have, my curiosity turning into a gnawing anxiety that kept me awake at night. I would lie in bed, listening to the silence of the neighborhood, waiting for the sound of his shovel hitting the dirt or the heavy thud of those blue drums hitting the garage floor. My house began to feel like it was falling apart in sympathy with my nerves. One night, the plumbing went haywire out of nowhere, a horrible gurgling noise coming from the pipes before water started gushing out of the kitchen sink, flooding the downstairs and damaging the walls and wiring. It felt deliberate, though I couldn't prove it then. I was hauling a bag of clothes to my car, prepared to find a hotel, when Arthur stepped in with that disarming smile of his. "Nonsense," he said, gesturing toward his own pristine home. "Stay with me. I've got plenty of space and I wouldn't want you sleeping in a soggy house." I hesitated, the memory of his missing neighbors lingering in the back of my mind, but I was desperate and exhausted. He assured me I'd be doing him a favor, claiming the house felt too empty these days. That last comment gave me pause, a fleeting moment of clarity that I brushed off as his loneliness. I packed a bag and crossed the driveway, walking directly into the trap he had been setting for weeks. As the heavy front door clicked shut behind me, I didn't realize that I wasn't a guest. I was the next ingredient. The guest room was situated at the very top of the house, a space Arthur called the observation suite, with a wink that I mistook for grandfatherly wit. The air up there was different from the rest of the pristine corridors. It carried a faint, metallic tang that no amount of lavender sachets could fully mask. As I unpacked my meager bag, I noticed the door wasn't a standard bedroom fixture. It was a heavy industrial slab of oak, reinforced with a steel frame, and the latch didn't click. It thudded with the finality of a bolt sliding into place on a cell. I ran my hand over the wood, feeling the vibrations of the house, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from deep beneath the floorboards. Arthur stood in the doorway, his silhouette cast long and jagged by the hallway light, watching me with a stillness that made the hair on my arms stand up. He didn't leave until I was tucked under the unnaturally heavy wool blankets, his parting words a soft, sibilant wish for sweet, tender dreams that felt more like a command than a blessing. Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it was fractured by the rhythmic, mechanical sounds leaking through the vents. It began around 2 a.m, a high-pitched, wet whirring, followed by the sound of something dense being dragged across a concrete floor. I pressed my ear to the floorboards, the cold wood biting into my skin, and listened as the house breathed with the labor of a hidden industry. There was a wet, slapping sound, like a heavy mop hitting a floor, but it was too irregular, too heavy. It sounded like a slab of wet clay being dropped from a height. My mind raced through the mundane possibilities: a malfunctioning furnace, a late-night laundry cycle, but none of them fit the organic, visceral quality of the noise. It was the sound of something being dismantled, joint by joint, in a space where no one was supposed to be working. The next morning, the kitchen was a stage for a culinary display that bordered on the obscene. Arthur had prepared a breakfast that looked like it belonged in a medieval banquet. There were tureens of dark, marbled meat, bowls of thick, ruby-red preserves that looked like clotted silk, and a centerpiece of roasted bone marrow that glistened under the recessed lighting. He moved with a terrifying grace, his hands, those surgeon's hands, trembling slightly with what I realized was excitement. "The secret to a long life is the consumption of vitality," he whispered, sliding a plate toward me. The meat was exceptionally tender, a pale, fine-grained cut that I couldn't identify. It had a sweetness to it, a cloying richness that coated the roof of my mouth and left a lingering, iron-like aftertaste. As I ate, Arthur didn't touch his own plate. He simply watched my throat as I swallowed, his eyes dilated, tracking the movement of my esophagus with a hunger that made me want to retch. I spent the afternoon trying to find an excuse to leave, but the house had become a labyrinth of locked doors and maintenance zones. Every time I turned a corner, Arthur was there, a damp rag in one hand and a bottle of industrial-grade disinfectant in the other. He was obsessed with the floor drains in the pantry and the mudroom, scrubbing them until the plastic glowed, yet the smell of the house was changing. The bleach was losing the war against a rising scent of rot, a sweet, sickly, thick aroma of decomposing sugars and old blood. I followed the scent to a small closet beneath the stairs, the door slightly ajar. Inside, I didn't find coats. I found a stack of cardboard boxes, their bottoms soaked through with a dark, yellowish fluid that had crystallized into a sticky amber. I leaned in, my heart hammering against my teeth, and saw the labels. Organic waste, batch 42. The investigation took a darker turn when I found the first piece of physical evidence. I had returned to the guest room to find my bag had been moved. In the process of checking my belongings, I kicked a loose floorboard near the radiator. It shifted with a hollow groan. I pried it up, expecting dust and old wiring, but instead, my fingers brushed against something cold and greasy. I pulled out a bundle of hair, long blonde strands matted together with thick black sludge. Tucked inside the hair was a child's barrette, a cheap plastic butterfly caked in dried brown crust. My breath hitched, a cold realization washing over me like ice water. This wasn't a house of success. It was a larder. The family recipes Arthur bragged about weren't handed down through generations of chefs. They were harvested from the neighbors who had stood on his porch and praised his gardens. The pattern of his contributions to the town suddenly snapped into focus. The missing runaways, the vanished pets, the family from 3 streets over. They hadn't left. They had been invited over for dinner. I remembered the way the townspeople spoke of his secret marinade, a thick, dark sauce that he gave out in jars every autumn. I realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror that I had likely consumed a portion of the missing teenagers from the local high school that very morning. The meat was too pale, too soft to be anything else. My stomach cramped, a violent surge of bile rising in my throat as the vitality Arthur spoke of began to feel like a poison circulating through my veins. I wasn't just a guest, I was being seasoned. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the observation suite, I heard the basement door open, the heavy, hydraulic hiss of a seal breaking. Then came the sound I will never forget, the sharp, rhythmic snap of a bone saw being tested. It was a clean, professional sound. I stood in the center of the room, staring at the heavy oak door, and realized that the latch didn't just lock from the inside. Arthur had engaged a secondary deadbolt from the hallway. I was trapped in a cage at the top of a slaughterhouse, listening to the man downstairs prepare the tools for my own harvest. The smells of the house were no longer hidden. The vents were pumping in the scent of a fresh kill, a raw, hot odor of open cavities and steaming viscera that told me the night's work had already begun. The metallic whine of the bone saw eventually died down, replaced by a rhythmic, wet thudding that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. It sounded like someone tenderizing a massive slab of meat with a heavy wooden mallet, a sound that went on for hours in the oppressive dark of the observation suite. I huddled in the corner of the room, my eyes fixed on the heavy oak door, waiting for the secondary bolt to slide back, but Arthur remained downstairs, occupied by his grisly labor. The air in the attic began to grow colder, a draft from the ventilation system carrying the unmistakable, cloying scent of raw copper and open cavities. I realized then that the house wasn't just a home. It was a sophisticated processing plant, and the clinical smell I had noted upon my arrival was the scent of a man who treated butchery like a religious rite. Driven by a desperate, nauseating need to know the truth, I began to examine the mini fridge Arthur had so thoughtfully stocked for my stay. I had assumed it contained water and soda, but when I pulled the handle, the seal broke with a wet, sticky resistance. Inside there were no drinks. Instead, there were rows of glass jars filled with a clear, viscous liquid. Suspended in the fluid were what looked like pale, translucent mushrooms, but as I tilted the jar toward the dim moonlight, the caps resolved into human ears meticulously trimmed and preserved. My heart hammered against my ribs, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead as I shoved the jar back and slammed the door. The realization that I'd been sleeping in a room filled with trophies made the very air feel like it was thickening, turning into a soup of dead skin and old blood. I couldn't stay in the bed. Every fiber of the mattress felt like it was woven from the hair I had found beneath the floorboards. I spent the rest of the night prowling the small perimeter of the attic, looking for any weakness in the construction. Near the back of the room, behind a stack of old medical journals, I found a small circular vent that led directly into the wall cavity. I pressed my face against the slats, and for the first time, I could see down into the hobby room through a gap in the insulation. The scene below was a nightmare of surgical precision. Arthur was hunched over a stainless steel table, bathed in the harsh, blue glow of industrial strip lights. He was wearing a heavy rubber apron, his bare arms splattered with a dark, glistening crimson that looked almost black under the fluorescent hum. On the table lay the remains of what appeared to be a young man, though man was no longer an accurate description. Arthur was working with a methodical, terrifying speed, using a series of scalpels to peel back the skin in long, even strips, which he then rolled tightly and placed into plastic containers. He wasn't just killing. He was harvesting materials with the detachment of a craftsman. I watched, unable to look away. He paused to take a bite from a small, raw sliver of meat he had just removed, his blue eyes gleaming with a feral, hollow intensity. He chewed slowly, a look of profound peace crossing his face before returning to his task with renewed vigor. The family recipes were real, and I was currently being kept in the pantry until my own vitality reached its peak. The horror intensified when I realized the tapping I had heard earlier wasn't someone drumming their fingers. It was the sound of small, heavy objects being dropped into a metal bucket. I watched Arthur reach into a pile of discarded clothing and pull out a wallet, flipping through the contents with a bored expression before tossing it into a corner, already overflowing with leather goods and ID cards. He then picked up a pair of heavy pliers and began working on the victim's mouth, the sharp clink of teeth hitting the bottom of the bucket echoing up through the vents. This was the source of the cluttered feel of the attic. The boxes lining the walls weren't filled with books, but with the discarded lives of everyone who had ever stepped foot into Arthur Vance's perfect life. As dawn began to gray the edges of the attic window, I heard the basement door hiss shut and the heavy, slow footsteps of Arthur ascending the stairs. I scrambled back into the bed, pulling the heavy wool blankets up to my chin and forcing my breathing to slow into a rhythm of fake sleep. I heard the secondary bolt slide back, the sound of the oak door creaking open just a fraction of an inch. I didn't open my eyes, but I could feel his presence in the room, the smell of bleach and raw meat radiating off him like a heat haze. He stood by the bed for what felt like an eternity, his shadow falling across my face. I heard him lean down, the soft rasp of his breath inches from my ear. "You're ripening beautifully," he whispered, his voice a dry, papery husk of its former charm. "The adrenaline is finally starting to marinate the marrow." The morning sun did not bring the usual suburban relief. Instead, it illuminated the thin layer of gray dust settling over the attic, a powder I realized with a jolt was likely the pulverized remains of bone from the vents. Arthur had left the door unlocked, a gesture of predatory confidence that chilled me more than the deadbolt ever could. He was downstairs, the sound of a heavy cast-iron skillet scraping against the stove, signaling the start of another feast. I knew I had to move to find a way out before the ripening process he mentioned reached its conclusion. My legs felt like lead as I crept out of the bed, my eyes darting to the boxes lined against the walls. I began to tear them open, my fingers trembling as I bypassed the old medical journals and dug into the layers of fabric and leather hidden beneath. Inside the first box were rows of children's shoes, their laces tied together in neat, clinical pairs. There were dozens of them, ranging from toddler sneakers to polished Sunday flats, each pair tagged with a date and a weight. The second box was filled with eyeglasses, the lenses cracked and smeared with a dried yellow film that smelled of old sweat and terror. It wasn't just a collection. It was a warehouse of the discarded. I found a stack of driver's licenses, the faces of my missing neighbors staring back at me with frozen, optimistic smiles. Among them was the woman from Source, the one whose disappearance had caused the town to buzz with whispers. Seeing her ID tucked into a box of scraps made the reality of Arthur's depravity settle into my bones like an icy fever. I ventured out of the attic, my bare feet silent on the plush hallway carpet. The house felt different in the daylight, sharper, more jagged. I reached the landing and looked down into the foyer, where the sunlight hit a large, ornate vase. Upon closer inspection, the decorative stones at the bottom weren't river rocks. They were knuckles and vertebrae, bleached, white, and polished to a high gloss. Arthur was in the dining room, his back to me, humming a low, tuneless melody as he plated the morning's offering. The smell was overpowering, a heavy, caramelized scent of roasting fat and sage that made my stomach cramp with a violent, involuntary hunger. It was the same mouth-watering aroma I had smelled when I first arrived, a scent designed to bypass the brain and speak directly to the animal instincts of the gut. I bypassed the stairs and slipped into Arthur's private study, a room I had been forbidden from entering. The walls were lined with jars similar to the ones in my mini fridge, but these were larger, containing entire sections of the human anatomy, preserved in a golden, syrupy liquid. There were lungs that looked like blackened sponges, a heart suspended by silver wires, and a shelf dedicated entirely to the tongue, featuring specimens of various lengths and textures. On his desk sat a leather-bound ledger. I opened it to the most recent entry, dated the day my plumbing had failed. It was a checklist. Subject, neighbor. Status, marinating. Current weight, 185 pounds. Goal, 170 pounds, leaner cut preferred. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Arthur hadn't just sabotaged my house to bring me here. He was actively monitoring my physiological state to ensure the quality of the meat. He was waiting for my fear to peak, for the cortisol to flood my system and change the chemistry of my muscles. I heard the floorboard creak behind me. I didn't turn around. I could feel the cold, sharp presence of his unsettling blue eyes boring into the back of my skull. He wasn't angry that I was in his study. He was delighted. The curiosity of the prey always adds a certain piquant quality to the final result, he whispered, his voice dangerously close to my ear. I felt the cold press of a surgical blade against the nape of my neck, the steel vibrating with the slight tremor of his anticipation. He didn't slice. He just traced the line of my spine, his touch as light as a feather. Go back upstairs, guest. Dinner tonight requires a very specific state of mind, and you are almost there. I stumbled out of the room, my vision blurring as the clinical perfection of the house began to dissolve into a kaleidoscope of red and white. I was no longer a person. I was a family recipe in the making, and the chef was losing his patience. The descent into the basement felt like entering the gullet of a great concrete beast, the air thickening with the humid, copper-heavy steam of a commercial kitchen. Arthur didn't drag me. He walked behind me, the surgical blade occasionally grazing my lower back as a reminder of his clinical precision. The hobby room was even more grotesque under the flicker of the failing fluorescent tubes, the floor drains gurgling with a thick, dark slurry that refused to wash away. He forced me into a chair, not the plush dining furniture from upstairs, but a cold metal stool bolted to the floor, surrounded by the white coffins of his deep freezers. You've seen the inventory, so you understand the necessity of the preparation, he whispered, his blue eyes burning with a feral intensity as he reached for a heavy, motorized bone saw. The high-pitched whine of the blade, starting up, drowned out the sound of my own panicked breathing, a mechanical scream that seemed to vibrate through my very marrow. The escalation was a blur of steel and desperation as Arthur lunged, the blade arcing toward my chest with a practiced, butcher-like fluidity. I barely dodged, the wind of the spinning metal cold against my skin, and swung a heavy glass jar from a nearby shelf, a jar containing a meticulously preserved human lung. It shattered against his shoulder, drenching him in the stinging, golden preservative, but he didn't flinch. He simply licked a drop of the fluid from his lip and charged again. We grappled on the slick floor, his strength unnatural, his corded muscles pressing me down against the edge of a freezer until I could feel the biting cold of the steel. "What was the food like?" he hissed, his face a grotesque mask of rage and hunger. "Did you enjoy the vitality of your neighbors?" The realization of what I'd consumed fueled a final, violent surge of adrenaline, and I managed to shove him back, his heel catching on a loose floorboard. The escape was not a heroic dash, but a frantic scramble through the gore and the darkness. As Arthur stumbled, I bolted for the stairs, the sound of his heavy, deliberate footsteps following close behind, each thud a promise of what was to come. I burst through the front door just as the first flicker of blue and red lights cut through the suburban gloom. The police didn't find a grieving widower. They found a monster drenched in the family recipes of an entire street. When they finally cornered him in the kitchen, he didn't surrender. He turned on them with a madness that sent a chill through the room, forcing them to open fire until his body jolted and collapsed onto the pristine wood floors he had spent years scrubbing. As I sat on the curb, wrapped in a blanket, a detective approached me with a look of profound disbelief, holding a handgun they had found tucked into Arthur's waistband. He could have ended it quickly, but he had chosen the knife, wanting to savor the struggle piece by piece. Days later, when the investigation moved from Arthur's house to mine, the detective called me, her voice shaking as she explained that the plumbing disaster hadn't been an accident. They had found Arthur's fingerprints and hair in my basement, proof that he had orchestrated the flood to force me into his larder. He had been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to enroll me into his collection of family recipes. But the lingering horror isn't the memory of the basement or the calculated trap. It's the physical sensation that remains. Every time I catch a glimpse of something shiny, like a wedding ring, my stomach churns with the memory of what I found in the bile after that first mouth-watering dinner. I'm safe now, living miles away from Blackwood Lane. But the confession isn't over. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, the taste of that rich, tender meat returning to the back of my tongue like a ghostly seasoning. I look at my own hands in the moonlight and wonder, how much of me is left? And how much of me is now composed of the neighbors Arthur Vance so carefully prepared? The town struggled to recover, haunted by the realization that a pillar of the community was a predator in their midst. But I am the one who carries the true weight of his legacy. I escape the attic and the blade, but as I stare at my reflection, I can't stop asking the same sickening question. If that was Lila's ring I saw in the mess, then what exactly was it that I found so delicious?